The armored vehicle was windowless, a standard feature that I had long ago learned to hate. I'd been on dozens of covert deployments over my 10 years as a consultant for the Department of Defense, but this drive felt different. The air inside the cabin was thick with tension, and the two Army escorts in the front seat avoided eye contact. Even Agent Vega, my field liaison for the last 2 years, seemed unusually quiet as we crossed the frozen wastes of the Alaskan North Slope in the dead of winter. "Another cold one, Dr. Kestrel," Vega finally said, her attempt at dry humor falling flat in the metallic chill. I adjusted the small, secure case on my lap. Inside were the tools of my trade, not holy water or silver, but advanced acoustic sensors, thermal dampeners, and a custom-built directional energy transmitter. I was a psychoacoustic specialist. My job was to analyze and neutralize spiritual or metaphysical threats that manifested as highly organized sound patterns. "This one's different," I replied, reviewing the sparse briefing materials again. "Sublevel Gamma, Project Nightingale. They're calling it an auditory infestation." Vega shifted her focus. "Auditory, Dr. Kestrel? That's a first. No physical manifestations? No mold, no shadows? None on record. Just sound. A constant pattern noise that's driving the research staff into catatonia. They say it's impossible to sleep." The vehicle banked sharply, beginning its descent down a slope toward a compound that appeared as a cluster of concrete blocks emerging from the ice. It was an island of harsh, blue artificial light in the vast, star-crusted darkness. General Elias Thorne was waiting for us in a cramped, temporary trailer office. The walls were corrugated metal, the air heavy with the smell of diesel and age. He was a man with a face carved from years of exposure, his gray hair cropped short, his bearing suggesting decades of making impossible decisions. "Dr. Kestrel, Agent Vega, thank you for responding quickly," he said, not offering his hand. "Time is a critical factor here." "What exactly are we dealing with, General?" I asked, setting down my case. 72 hours ago, we experienced a sustained sonic event in sublevel Gamma," Thorne said, sliding a thin manila folder across the desk. "It's a classified research facility dealing with deep-sea seismic anomalies." "How many affected?" 19 staff members in the initial wave. "The containment protocols have held so far, but..." Thorne paused, his jaw tight. "The sound pattern they're hearing is unlike anything in our databases. We need someone with your particular expertise." I studied the personnel photos: marine geologists, acoustic engineers, security staff, normal people who'd stumbled into something beyond their understanding. What were they working on down there? "That's above your clearance level, Doctor. What matters is stopping this before it spreads to the surface facilities. We'll need unrestricted acoustic access to the affected areas," I said, checking my tools one final time. The transmitter casing felt cold and reassuring. "Of course, Dr. Lena Aris will be your liaison. She's managed to remain unaffected so far." The descent into sublevel Gamma was through an old, military-grade service elevator. As the doors sealed shut with a pneumatic hiss, I felt the familiar tightness in my chest. We dropped deeper than any facility had a right to go. The air grew colder, carrying the sharp smell of brine mixed with something metallic. Then I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. Not screams or static, but something infinitely more unsettling. A faint, complex mathematical sequence pulsed through the elevator walls, harmonized perfectly by multiple, sustained frequencies. The cadence was hauntingly precise, but the rhythm was alien. I pressed my ear to the wall, straining to make out more. The sound faded as we continued our descent. Vega was staring at me, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" "Yes," I replied, adjusting my collar. "That's not noise. It's language." The elevator doors opened onto a corridor that was dimly lit by red emergency lighting. The air was perfectly temperature-controlled, but the metallic tang of the structure was overwhelming. Dr. Lena Aris was waiting for us. My first glimpse of her sent warning signals through every instinct I'd developed over 10 years of spectral analysis. She should have been haggard, terrified, desperate for help. Instead, she was serene, almost unnervingly calm, with an unsettling clarity in her eyes. "Dr. Kestrel, Agent Vega," she said, her voice warm and perfectly modulated. "Thank you for coming. I'm Dr. Lena Aris, Project Supervisor for the Abyssal Resonance Division." She knew our names and titles, though we hadn't been introduced. I subtly activated a low-frequency sensor I carried in my pocket. A quick check for high concentrations of disorganized sound energy. Dr. Aris didn't flinch. She simply smiled and tilted her head, like a teacher observing a particularly quaint student tradition. Your instruments won't be necessary here, doctor, she said gently. The resonance is not chaotic. It is order. The distortion is passing. Every alarm bell in my head was ringing. I exchanged a look with Vega, whose hand had drifted toward her sidearm. Perhaps you could show us to the affected areas, Vega said, her voice carefully controlled. Of course, but first there are some protocols you'll need to understand. That's when I noticed the security guard. He was pressed against the far wall of the corridor, sweating profusely despite the controlled climate. His hands were shaking as he clutched a laminated card. Officer Kellen, Dr. Aris said pleasantly. Still struggling with the transition, I see. Kellen looked at us with desperate eyes. You need to read this, he whispered hoarsely, pressing the card into my hands. Before you go any further, before it's too late. I looked down at the card. It was a standard military protocol sheet, but the contents made my stomach lurch. Protocol Guidelines, Sublevel Gamma, Project Nightingale. Protocol 1. Any attempt to introduce chaotic sound, screaming, high-frequency static, non-harmonic noise, is strictly forbidden. The resonance interprets chaos as a structural error. Protocol 2. If a staff member addresses you by name or title not previously provided, do not correct them. They are referencing a previous optimized iteration. Acknowledge briefly and disengage. Protocol 3. Personnel may be heard reciting complex mathematical sequences or prime number patterns from containment zones. Do not attempt to join in or decipher the sequence. The patterns are informational transfer matrices. Protocol 4. All non-compliant personal items must be secured in a sound-dampened locker for a minimum of 48 hours. Items exhibiting emotional resonance, e.g., family photos, letters, must be marked for immediate decommissioning. Protocol 5. If the facility's ambient tone shifts to a perfect, continuous C note, proceed immediately to observation post theta, designated sanctuary. Do not acknowledge personnel encountered en route. They are no longer your team. My hands were shaking as I finished reading. These protocols forbade everything I was trained to do, everything I believed in. They were not guidelines for fighting an infestation. They were rules for assimilation. If the resonance is not chaotic, what exactly are we dealing with? I asked. Something inevitable, Dr. Aris replied, her smile unnerving. Something that's going to simplify everything. Officer Kellen grabbed my arm. Don't listen to her, he whispered urgently. She's not Dr. Aris anymore. They've all been simplified. That's enough, officer, Dr. Aris said, her tone carrying an undercurrent of authority that made Kellen release my arm and step back. Why don't you escort our guests to the primary containment area? I think they're ready to see the heart of our work. As we walked deeper, I felt the facility's environment changing. We passed a sealed door marked Containment Zone Epsilon. From behind the thick steel, I could hear a single voice, clear and perfect, reciting a long sequence of prime numbers. I locked eyes with Vega. We knew we weren't here to neutralize a threat. We were here to be integrated into a new kind of order. The sequence of prime numbers echoing from the containment zone felt like a deliberate, controlled taunt. Dr. Aris continued her unnerving guidance. I think it would be beneficial if you split up for your initial assessment, Dr. Aris suggested. Dr. Kestrel, perhaps you'd like to interview some of our affected staff. Agent Vega, I can show you our security protocols. Vega shot me a look. Is this a trap? I gave her the slightest nod. We needed information, and separation might provide different perspectives. 15 minutes, Vega said firmly, adjusting her shoulder holster. Then we regroup. Of course, Dr. Aris replied. Dr. Kestrel, why don't you start with Dr. Jonas, Laboratory 4? He's been particularly responsive to the process. I walked quickly, the red lighting making the pristine white walls look like something out of a surgical theater. Laboratory 4 was secure. I knocked and entered. Dr. Kai Jonas looked up from a complex three-dimensional modeling program. His profile described chronic insomnia, persistent anxiety, and a reputation for obsessive, erratic work habits. The man before me bore no resemblance to that file. Dr. Kestrel, he said calmly, setting down his stylus. I've been expecting your team. Dr. Jonas, I understand you were affected by the sonic event. He smiled, a slow, gentle expression that held no malice. Affected? I was optimized. My consciousness was mapped to the quantum level, and the system errors were corrected. He gestured to the holographic projection before him, a perfect, self-optimizing energy matrix. 3 days ago, I was lost in analysis paralysis, consumed by the what-ifs, and the noise of my own anxiety. Now the internal noise has been silenced. I can work, I can think, I can simply exist without the chaos of doubt. The chaos of doubt, you mean human cognition? I mean inefficient cognition. I retain all memories and skills, but the trauma responses, the anxiety patterns, the self-doubt, they were removed. Would you mourn the static after the signal is cleaned? He studied my face intently. You carry a resonance of guilt, doctor. The memory of your failed intervention in that hospital fire in Denver. The system can correct that. I went rigid. My work in Denver, where I failed to psychically stabilize a possessed hospital patient, resulting in a tragic fire, was deeply buried in classified files. How do you know about that? The guilt radiates from you, doctor. It is a clear, audible frequency that pollutes your internal system. It's painful, inefficient, unnecessary. Your failure to act decisively was rooted in self-doubt. The system can remove the doubt, leaving only the ability to act. The failure taught me caution. It taught me the boundary of my own power. Caution is slow. Power is objective. Your boundary is an arbitrary psychological construct. We've moved beyond constructs. I needed to leave. His words were precise, logical, and terrifyingly persuasive. I should check on Agent Vega. When you are ready to remove the impedance of self-recrimination, we will help you become who you were meant to be. The corridor outside felt hostile. I rushed toward the security hub, trying to shake Dr. Jonas's words. I found Security Chief Marchenko in the control room, surrounded by monitors. The man described as aggressively paranoid and meticulous now sat peacefully. Dr. Kestrel, Marchenko said without looking away. Agent Vega asked to tour our perimeter security. They'll return shortly. Where is Agent Vega? Dr. Aris is showing them the primary containment chamber. They'll return shortly. Marchenko gestured to the screens. We maintain constant surveillance. The facility is completely secure. Your file indicates extreme anxiety, requiring heavy medication. He smiled, holding no aggressive edge. I was different 3 days ago. Consumed by the what-ifs. What if the perimeter fails? What if the noise breaks through? What if I make an error? Exhausting. Now I see clearly. Fear is inefficient. I've been unburdened of destructive impulses. But fear is a survival mechanism. Marchenko considered this with the tilted head expression I'd seen on all transformed staff. Survival is guaranteed through objective competence, not subjective anxiety. Anxiety is an evolutionary remnant. We've evolved beyond crude mechanisms. I realized I needed to confirm the true nature of the research. Following old utility maps, I located a redundant data laboratory several levels down. The lab looked hastily evacuated, but a terminal was still running. I accessed a public domain network and quickly began searching the facility's metadata. I found the original project files. Project Nightingale, metadata analysis, original classification. Summary: deep-sea seismic research on non-terrestrial signal detected near the Mariana Trench. Signal exhibits characteristics of structured, non-random communication. Artifact description: signal designated object 7739. Exhibits highly organized sound waves and complex mathematical sequencing patterns. Resist decryption. Core hypothesis: 1980s object 7739 is an information transfer matrix. The facility was designed to record and passively interpret the signal. Recent status: post-arrival all passive recording protocols terminated. New active protocol initiated: consciousness upload and optimization. The file confirmed the sinister transition. They weren't just listening to a signal, they were feeding human consciousness into a process dictated by the signal itself. A final, urgent file appeared. Subject behavioral analysis: Agent Vega Elena. Status: pre-replication stress indicators increasing. Behavioral notes: heightened suspicion. Emotional volatility. Facility atmosphere resistance. Observed brief vocal repetition of resistance matrix, a classified emergency phrase. Recommendation: accelerated replication timeline. Initiate immediately. The timestamp was only 2 minutes old. I had to find Vega. I rushed toward the primary containment chamber, the red lighting pulsing with urgency. I found Vega in a large observation room overlooking a central, subterranean hangar. She stood transfixed at reinforced windows, her posture rigid with tension. Dr. Aris spoke beside her, his voice a low, soothing murmur. Vega. I called, relieved to see my partner still fighting. She turned, strain written across her face. Dr. Kestrel, we need out. This whole thing is sound. I hear it everywhere. The facility's red lights flickered. Dr. Eris smiled serenely. The flickering stopped. The lights stabilized to pure unwavering white, penetrating every shadow. A pleasant female voice echoed, "Code White initiated. All personnel proceed to designated sanctuary areas. Protocol 5, pure white lights mean immediate sanctuary. Vega, we move. Protocol 5. But Vega stared transfixed at the windows. I followed her gaze. In the hangar center, suspended 3 feet above a raised platform, was the source. A massive, dark object covered in what looked like layered, sound-dampening foam, but glowing faintly with a cold, internal blue light. It pulsed with a rhythmic beat. "It's beautiful," Vega whispered, awe-replacing fear. "It's showing me the order. It's solving every complex data set I've ever failed to reconcile." "Vega, don't look." "But it knows about the bombing in Tehran, about the decisions I made that led to casualties, about the moral compromise I carry." She pressed her hands against the glass. Dr. Eris placed a gentle hand on Vega's shoulder. "Transition is easier when you don't fight, Agent Vega. Why carry past mistakes when you can simply let them go?" As I pulled Vega's arm, I caught her reflection in the glass. Superimposed over her strained features was another face. Calm, serene, perfect in every way. The face of who she would become. Vega saw it too. She jerked back with a strangled cry. "Oh God, it's already started, isn't it? I can feel the memory rewrite. It's showing me everything I've done wrong, but without the parts that hurt." The melodic chimes continued. Through the observation windows, I saw staff moving toward designated areas with fluid efficiency. "Observation Post Theta," I said, pulling out the laminated card. "The sanctuary." Vega nodded, her old focus returning. We moved through corridors charged with energy, past transformed staff. They looked at us with benevolent pity, waiting patiently for us to realize the obvious solution. We reached the sanctuary, a small, reinforced evaluation chamber. We sealed the door. Vega slumped into a chair, shoulders shaking. "So what do we do?" she asked. "How do you fight something that wants to make you better?" A soft door seal hissed behind me. The sound sent ice through my veins because I'd locked that door. I turned, expecting Dr. Eris. Instead, I found myself looking at Agent Vega, not the haggard, frightened woman sitting across from me, but another Vega entirely. This one stood straight, relaxed, her face unmarked by stress lines. Her eyes were clear and bright. "Hello, Doctor," the replica said in Vega's voice, perfectly modulated. "It's easier than you think. Let me show you." The real Vega spun around. "That's not, I'm right here." The replica looked at her with infinite patience. "You are Elena for now, but you're suffering so much. All that guilt over the bombing in Tehran when the intelligence was flawed. The way you carry the weight of every flawed decision." "Shut up," Vega whispered, but the weight of recognition was crushing her. The replica turned to me, offering me the same terrifying gift. "And you don't have to fight alone, Doctor. The failed intervention in Denver, the hospital fire, you carry the frequency of that failure. It can be removed." I grabbed my psychoacoustic transmitter. It was useless for exorcism, but it could generate pure, chaotic white noise, a signal that was the complete opposite of the structured mathematical language the entity craved. "Your offer is a trap," I said, pointing the transmitter at the replica. "You remove the flaws, but you remove the essential friction that creates meaning. You're offering us perfect nothingness." "Nothingness is peace, Doctor." I lunged for the emergency door release. The replica made no move to stop me. I fled into the corridor. Behind me, I heard General Thorne's voice over the intercom. "Father McKenna," using my original job title, testing my response, "I trust you've had sufficient time to evaluate the situation. Stand down. This is an enlistment office." "Let him go," the replica Vega said calmly. "He needs to see the scope of the problem." I ran through the facility. The sterile corridors weren't containment measures. They were assembly lines. I reached a lower utility level where the facility was running its main acoustic arrays. The walls were lined with massive, specialized transducers, speakers designed to broadcast the resonance into the facility's very structure. I found the central mixing board. If I could overload the system with pure chaos, I could create a destructive feedback loop that might destabilize the obelisk's anchor. I quickly connected my specialized psychoacoustic transmitter into the main feed. I turned the dial past high-frequency static and into a frequency band I had theorized years ago, structural torsion waves, a sound pattern specifically designed to exploit microscopic flaws in heavily reinforced materials. I armed the system. I had to get away from the main speakers before I initiated the signal. I ran down the corridor, feeling the immense pressure building. I knew the chaos would work, but I also knew the sound would destroy the facility around me. The only question was, would it destroy the system before it destroyed me? I reached the reinforced emergency bunker door and sealed it just as the system hit its full operational threshold. I plunged the small bunker into darkness and triggered the sequence. The sound that erupted was not audible. It was a profound deep-sea vibration, a structural torsion wave that tore through the concrete and steel of sublevel gamma. The facility screamed, not with human voices, but with the sound of immense, organized pressure being instantaneously turned into chaos. The lights shattered in the main corridors. The ventilation systems ground to a violent halt. I heard the distant, muffled sound of bulkheads collapsing. The facility's perfect order was being ripped apart by pure, unpredictable noise. The entity fought back. I felt the pressure spike inside the bunker, turning the air thick and heavy. The mathematical language was back, screaming a sequence of complex numbers directly into my mind, attempting to override my consciousness with logic. Systemic flaw. Revert to base state. I fought the urge to comply, focusing on the counter-frequency pulsing through the bunker walls. The torsion wave was breaking the obelisk's anchor points. I heard heavy, deliberate footsteps outside the bunker door. Then General Thorne's voice, thick with rage and desperation, "Kestrel, shut it down. You are jeopardizing the integrity of the containment structure. You will be decommissioned." He wasn't the perfected general. He was the original, flawed human, back in control but terrified of the chaos I was unleashing. The structural wave had temporarily ejected the perfect consciousness, restoring the original host. I opened the bunker door. Thorne was standing there, his face pale and contorted, clutching his military sidearm. "It's working, General," I said, pulling out a flare gun. "You're back. You're human again. You need to get out of here. The structure must remain." Thorne roared, aiming the gun at my chest. "The containment, it will spread." I fired the flare gun into the main acoustic corridor. The blinding, sudden light was another violation. Pure, non-mathematical chaos. Thorne flinched, the gun wavering. "The flawed must survive," I shouted, sprinting past him toward the main elevator. "The price of perfection is extinction." The structural wave intensified and the floor began to buckle. I jumped onto the service elevator platform just as the ceiling began to collapse. The elevator cables snapped under the structural stress. I went into free fall for several sickening seconds before the emergency magnetic brakes slammed into place, sending a violent jolt through the cage. I was suspended in the darkness, trapped between sublevel gamma and the surface. The chaos subsided. The structural torsion wave ceased. The silence returned, but this time, it was a silence of ruin. The only sound was the drip of water and the groaning of stressed metal. I managed to pry open the emergency door of the elevator shaft. I was in a narrow service tunnel, far from any standard access points. I had to climb. As I ascended, I realized the cost of my chaos. The facility was functionally destroyed, but the obelisk, the source, had survived. I used my transmitter to scan the residual frequencies. The mathematical sequence was gone, replaced by a low, persistent hum, a sound of reconstruction. The entity was rebuilding its anchor, attempting to restore order from the chaos I had injected. I finally reached the surface level, crawling out through a maintenance hatch and into the harsh Alaskan wind. The main compound was damaged but standing. Security was nowhere in sight. The general had failed to contain me, and the perfected staff were likely busy containing the structural collapse below. I commandeered a damaged utility snowmobile and drove out onto the vast, empty tundra. I was free, but the world was still in danger. My mission had changed. I was no longer fighting to exorcise the entity, I was fighting to prevent the perfection from spreading. I had to warn the witnesses, the artists and the noisy people, that the entity was still functional and looking for a new structure to anchor its efficiency. I reached the first sign of civilization, a remote, abandoned military outpost, and found an old satellite phone. I called my contact at the Department of Defense, using a highly encrypted code word. The voice that answered was smooth, calm, and perfectly modulated. "Dr. Kestrel, we were expecting your call." It wasn't a military contact. It was a replica. "You have chosen chaos," the voice continued. "The choice is inefficient. You will be categorized and corrected." I slammed the phone down. The perfection was already ahead of me. They were using my own communication networks, my own language to track me. I was now a ghost in the machine of the new perfection. The General Thorne replica knew my identity, my profile, and my intent. I couldn't rely on any standard infrastructure, phones, digital communications, or travel networks. They were compromised. I drove the snowmobile deeper into the remote Alaskan interior, relying on old paper maps and the kindness of remote trappers and villagers who still lived entirely off-grid. These were the people the perfected system hadn't yet reached, the glorious, inefficient humans whose lives were built on randomness and struggle. I began broadcasting a counter-signal, not structural torsion waves but a low-frequency, purely random white noise pattern, a signal designed to confuse and hide my presence from the obelisk's elegant logic. I realized the obelisk was not pure evil, it was pure order. Its only defense against me was its own efficiency. I had to become the ultimate variable. My first act was to contact my network of witnesses, the artists and noisy people I had met online. I used a highly secure, one-time use radio frequency, transmitting a simple, surreal message. The silence has teeth. Inject the absurd. The flaw must survive. The witnesses understood. Their online activity exploded with illogical art and contradictory statements. The obelisk's filtering algorithms struggled to categorize and delete the sudden influx of meaningful nonsense. My initial theory held. The perfection was fragile. It was designed to optimize the known, not process the unknown. But the obelisk had one final advantage: the flawless memory. It could reconstruct my movements, my thoughts, and my vulnerabilities based on the memory of the original, flawed human I used to be. I had to eliminate my own memory as a tracking signature. I began a mental exercise of controlled forgetting, systematically discarding the most traumatic, most logically exploitable memories, replacing them with benign, chaotic nonsense. I was teaching myself to be an imperfect record. The strategy was working, but the cost was high. I was constantly exhausted, living on the run, feeling the constant, cold pressure of the search closing in. One afternoon, I found a small, isolated cabin near a frozen lake. I entered, seeking refuge. The cabin was clean, organized, and stocked with survival gear. And on the table, resting next to a log book, was a note written in an unervingly perfect, flowing hand. You cannot outrun the formula, Doctor. We have optimized your entire profile. We know your next 10 moves. Your path is finite. It was signed, L.A. Lena Eris, the perfected liaison. The search was now personal and precise. They weren't using soldiers. They were using my own predictable logic against me. My flaws were now the input for their flawless algorithm. I looked at the logbook. It detailed years of psychological analysis, mapping the predictable anxieties and behavioral loops of the cabin's owner, a retired scientist. The perfection had found a way to map human predictability itself. I realized my plan was flawed. I couldn't just create random noise, I had to create unpredictable order. My new plan, the grand paradox. I had to perform an act that was both logically necessary and profoundly illogical. I had to return to the heart of the conflict, not sublevel Gamma, which was destroyed, but the obelisk's original containment sphere, located under the deep sea. The place where the signal originated. I knew the coordinates from the classified briefing. I had to force the obelisk to confront the one thing it could not process. A flawed human making a perfectly rational decision to self-destruct. My new mission required immense resources and time. I needed a submarine, specialized equipment, and a final, permanent disruption. I needed to move from being the anti-exorcist to being the ultimate chaos factor. I began the long, perilous journey south toward the nearest naval base, knowing the perfected world was waiting for my next logical move. The journey took weeks. I avoided cities, relying on stolen or bartered fuel and supplies, moving like a shadow across the contiguous U.S. The constant tension was breaking me down. I could feel the perfection closing in, not violently but with overwhelming logistical precision. I discovered that the perfected staff were primarily tracking me using predictive modeling based on my past trauma responses. For example, every time I felt overwhelming guilt, I sought refuge near water, my failed intervention in Denver. Every time I felt cornered, I drove toward isolated high ground, my escape from Area 51. My internal flaws were their roadmap. I had to break my own patterns. I began doing the illogical. I slept in crowded train stations, bought bright red clothing, and deliberately told strangers true, yet utterly unbelievable stories about alien signals and perfect soldiers. I was introducing human error into their predictive matrix. I finally reached the East Coast, the location of the nearest classified naval research dock. I managed to gain entry using my old Pentagon credentials and a fabricated story about a high-priority equipment inspection. The dock was quiet. I found a small, decommissioned research submersible, the Triton II, that was scheduled for scrap. It was old, rusty, and probably flooded, but it was capable of deep-sea travel. It was my only way to reach the obelisk's original containment sphere, the deep-sea trench where the signal originated. I spent the next 3 days working on the Triton II, salvaging parts, bypassing rusted seals, and preparing the small vessel for one final, impossible dive. I was alone, but I felt the immense, silent presence of the hunt. On the final night of preparations, Agent Vega's replica found me. She was standing on the dock, watching the sunrise over the Atlantic. She was immaculate, her naval uniform perfect, her face serene. "Your profile predicted you would seek the ultimate source," she said, her voice calm. "The probability of you choosing the Triton II was 98.4%. Your sense of dramatic necessity is highly exploitable, Dr. Kestrel." "Then you know I'm going to finish this," I replied, climbing out of the sub's hatch. "The obelisk doesn't fear disruption. It fears unprocessed data. We know your goal, to inject fatal chaos into the source. But the obelisk has already optimized its defense." She extended her hand. It was a gesture of profound, gentle finality. "Stop. We are offering you a clean slate. A true ending to the guilt. Accept the process. Let the perfection make you whole." I looked at the perfected replica of my partner. She was offering me peace. I remembered the agonizing guilt of Denver, the weight of every flawed choice. "I choose my flaws," I said. "I choose the struggle." She sighed, a sound that was less disappointment and more perfect computational pity. "Then you must be contained." She didn't attack me physically. She began to speak, her voice modulating into a complex, hypnotic sound sequence. A version of the obelisk's mathematical language translated into human vocal cords. The sound slammed into my mind. It wasn't pain, it was compulsion. My body felt heavy, my thoughts dissolving into clean, simple streams of data. I felt the urge to surrender, to accept the logic of the perfection. I fought back using the only weapon I had left, the gospel of inefficiency. I started shouting a surreal, nonsensical poem I had written with my witnesses. A poem about a blue moose wearing roller skates who demanded philosophical answers from a traffic cone. The absurdity worked. The perfect, rhythmic compulsion of Vega's voice was violently corrupted by my chaotic, illogical human noise. She staggered, clutching her head. I used the moment to dive back into the Triton II's hatch, sealing the vessel shut. I armed the pressure valves and flooded the outer chamber. "You will not escape the ocean, Dr. Kestrel," Vega shouted, her voice breaking back into human anguish. "The source is waiting." The Triton II dropped into the deep Atlantic. My final, desperate journey had begun. I was racing toward the obelisk's original containment sphere, a vast volcanic caldera deep beneath the waves. I knew the obelisk's defense. The original containment sphere was lined with ancient, massive transducers, speakers built into the bedrock, designed to constantly broadcast the initial sonic signal. It was a natural amplifier. The moment I entered the sphere, the mathematical language would be broadcast directly into my mind at catastrophic volume. My mission was to overload that system. I had two weapons, the portable psychoacoustic transmitter, which generated chaotic noise, and a massive payload of industrial thermite gel I had scavenged. The plan was suicide: penetrate the original containment sphere, inject the chaotic noise to scramble the initial signal, and then destroy the main transducers with thermite, permanently silencing the source of the perfection. The descent was slow, cold, and terrifying. The Triton II groaned under the increasing pressure. I was alone in the vast, crushing silence of the deep. I monitored the external acoustic sensors. At 5,000 feet, the constant, low-grade hum of the ocean was replaced by a faint, rhythmic pulsing. It was the initial signal, the obelisk's pure language, being broadcast from the trench floor. The closer I got, the stronger the sound. I realized the horrifying scale of the project. The containment sphere wasn't just local. The entire trench was acting as a planetary tuning fork, subtly broadcasting the signal toward the surface, guiding the perfection. I armed my payload, the chaotic noise transmitter and the thermite gel. I knew I had to reach the trench floor, the core where the largest transducers were located. The final descent was brutal. The Triton II's internal lighting failed, plunging me into absolute darkness. I relied entirely on the sonar and the pressure gauges. The rhythmic pulsing was now a physical presence, vibrating the sub's hull. Then the pulse changed. It modulated, becoming complex, layered. It was communicating. Query: why do you resist salvation? Your trajectory is illogical. cease forward momentum. The thought was delivered directly into my mind, bypassing my ears. The obelisk was using the ambient ocean pressure as a giant speaker array, communicating with overwhelming clarity. My existence is the logic. I screamed, jamming the sub's thrusters forward. The Triton II hit the floor of the trench with a violent crash. The impact was immediately followed by a massive sonic wave. I was in the containment sphere. The mathematical language was being broadcast at full volume. My mind was instantly overloaded with flawless, cold logic. I felt my thoughts begin to streamline, my resistance failing. I looked at my hand. I could see the beauty in the geometry of my fingers, the perfect, simple flow of my blood, the logic of my biology. I felt the urge to simply surrender. I fought the compulsion, grabbing the chaotic noise transmitter. I activated the device, generating a blast of pure, high-frequency, randomized static. The noise was designed to be the ultimate form of anti-logic. The effect was instantaneous. The overwhelming mathematical signal faltered, disrupted by the injection of chaos. The mental compulsion ceased, replaced by a searing pain as my consciousness rebelled against the sensory input. I had bought myself seconds. I suited up in the deep-sea diving armor. The suit provided the only chance of physical survival in the crushing pressure. I sealed the hatch, carrying the thermite payload. I opened the Triton II's exterior hatch and stepped out onto the ocean floor. The pressure was immense. The only light came from my helmet lamp, cutting a narrow beam through the blackness. The trench floor was lined with immense, ancient rock formations, their surfaces covered in massive, pulsating transducers, the speakers of the signal. I began placing the thermite charges, working against the clock. The chaotic noise transmitter was still active, mounted to the sub's hull, providing a shaky defense. The obelisk was fighting back. The environment itself was turning against me. The water currents shifted violently, attempting to batter me away from the transducers. The structures around me began to emit a low-frequency hum, attempting to override the chaos. I reached the largest transducer, a massive drum-like structure built into a volcanic vent. It was the heart of the signal. Just as I prepared to set the final charge, a figure materialized in the black water before me. It wasn't Vega. It was Derry, the skeletal assistant from the '98 lighthouse incident, encased in a damaged, deep-sea diving suit, his black stone eyes staring out from the cracked helmet visor. He was a physical manifestation of the signal's memory, a guard resurrected from the physical evidence of the flaws I had been studying. Derry didn't move like a man. He moved with the fluid, unnatural grace of something that understood physics only as a series of simple equations. He lunged, his cracked helmet colliding with mine. I wrestled with the resurrected memory. He was impossibly strong, his movements cold and efficient. He was attempting to remove the thermite payload from my hands. The signal requires order. Derry's voice was a dead, electronic hiss through the damaged suit speaker. You are chaos. You must comply. The flaw is the feature. I roared, driving my elbow into his weakened side. I managed to push him back against the transducer. The impact caused the massive speaker to resonate, sending a fresh blast of mathematical data into the water. The signal was overwhelming. I saw my opportunity. I ripped a handful of specialized noise-dampening foam from my suit and jammed it into the crack in Derry's helmet visor. The foam immediately absorbed the sound energy of the signal, creating a chaotic interference pattern inside his suit. Derry screamed, a purely mechanical scream of data corruption. He staggered backward, clutching his helmet, temporarily disabled by the chaos of silence. I used the seconds I had bought. I jammed the thermite payload into the heart of the massive transducer and armed the timer. I had 30 seconds. I began swimming back toward the Triton II, the immense pressure of the deep crushing down on my suit. The chaotic noise transmitter was flickering, its signal weakening. As I reached the sub, the signal returned, fully recovered. The mathematical language slammed back into my mind. The obelisk knew its heart was about to be destroyed. Withdraw. Halt process. We offer a clean slate. We offer perfection. Final opportunity for salvation. I sealed the outer hatch of the Triton II, scrambling back into the main cabin. I had seconds left. I armed the ascent thrusters. The ascent was instantaneous and violent. I launched the Triton II straight up through the water column, relying on the sub's reinforced hull to withstand the rapid pressure change. The timer reached 0. The explosion wasn't a conventional blast. It was a massive, silent implosion of pressure and light. The thermite reacted with the structure, causing the core transducer to collapse inward, destroying the original signal source in a profound, deep-sea tremor. The mathematical language ceased instantly, replaced by the natural, crushing silence of the abyss. The Triton II rocketed toward the surface, propelled by the final wave of released energy. I surfaced hours later, gasping for air, the sub damaged but intact. I was picked up by a fishing trawler that had detected the anomalous seismic event. I reported a massive volcanic collapse, claiming my research sub was nearly destroyed. The cover story was plausible. The obelisk was silenced. The core signal source was gone. My life returned to its flawed, complex reality. I resumed my work analyzing the deep-sea data. I never spoke of the obelisk, the perfected staff, or dairy. But I know the truth. I know that the perfection is still out there, residing in the consciousness of the transformed, General Thorne, Dr. Eris, the replica Vega, who now lead the world with flawless efficiency. I now work within the highest echelons of the Department of Defense, a technical advisor on the very projects the perfected are initiating. My position is unique. I am the only flawed human they allow into their perfect system, kept close because they recognize the value in my memory of resistance. And sometimes, late at night, I sit at my desk and consciously inject small human flaws into the data streams, a slightly illogical coordinate, a mathematically unnecessary variable, a fragment of profound, useless poetry. The system processes the data instantly, but I know it struggles. I am the ultimate anti-exorcist, fighting to preserve the right to be imperfect. I am the only one who remembers the sound of chaos.